Hey everybody, it's Irene with BrainStormAcres, and today we're going to talk about drip irrigation. Now, if you've been watching us for a little while, you've seen me run around the yard on multiple occasions and create drip systems for our raised beds. Now, the first question people might have is, why bother? Well, did I have a drip irrigation system before I came to Arizona? No, didn't need it. When we lived in Massachusetts and Maine, it usually rained enough to water the garden. If it didn't, you just got out there with the hose and watered it a little bit and you were fine. The soil really absorbed the moisture well, and most of the time there was enough rain that you didn't need to water the garden much unless you were starting seeds. And then you'd get out there several days in a row until the seeds came up and, monitor it. But even in California, I did not need drip irrigation. I simply got my tin can out in the backyard every afternoon and watered. Now, recently I've had a couple of questions from people about drip irrigation and irrigation in general. And I've also had several positive comments about the fact that I was a really diligent hard worker and all that kind of stuff. Well, to be blunt, if you're not and you live in Arizona, your plants are going to die. And that's not just true of Arizona. It's true of any place that doesn't get enough rain. And that includes places that usually get enough rain but are having a drought. So I think it's time for people to understand what sort of options they had. And of course, you always have the hose. And I tell you what, late afternoon, cold beverage, hose in one hand, cold beverage in the other, wandering around the yard, watering things, nothing better. But if you're pressed for time, or if really you just want the results and you don't want to have to spend a huge amount of time out there making it happen, then you need an irrigation system. Now, what we have in our yard here is a professional level irrigation system. Pipes that are set into the ground so that they won't freeze. They are blown out at the end of the season. They're drained so that we won't crack any pipes, even if we get a super deep freeze, because the ground does freeze here in the wintertime. Now, there are places, plenty of places in the United States, mostly along the Gulf Coast in Florida, where it never really freezes below, say, the top inch. But we've seen it go down to about 18 inches here. And at that point, you're really glad that you put your pipes in deep. For most people, you're dealing with a situation where you have some sort of a hose spigot on the outside of your house. And what you want to do is you want to get the water from that hose spigot to your plant. Now, honestly, what I recommend for people who are beginning at this sort of thing is to buy a kit. Because when you're figuring all these details out, even if you write it down, you still might miss a piece and then you have to go back to the hardware store again, or the big box store. Most hardware stores and big box stores will carry this, at least the home repair places will. And I still recommend get yourself a kit. One of the big box stores that we go to more regularly than I'd like to think carries the kinds of kits where it'll gives you the whole thing, and it'll say something like patio watering kit, and it'll be a little box about yay big, and it'll have everything you need. It'll start with the connector that screws onto your outside faucet the same way as if you were putting a hose on, and it'll have all the connectors that you need to run around in a certain distance. And what they're assuming is that you have a patio situation where you have multiple flower pots or a couple of small beds and you want to water those things, and it'll have all the connectors for a certain number of those things, and it will say on the package how many connectors it has. And for a lot of people, that's all it takes. It's got everything in it. It's got the beginning where it attaches to the water, and it's got the end where you shut it so that it just doesn't run out like a hose. And that's what I recommend people do. Now, if you want to do it yourself, you can. And we did. Initially, I bought, and this was, like 17 years ago, I bought one of the little patio kits. And it did not have a timer. It didn't have anything except it had a connector that went to the hose bib and the faucet on the outside of your house, and which in our case is a frost-free faucet, common on ranches and farms, so that you don't freeze the pipes in the wintertime. It had the connector for that water source, and then it had all the bits and pieces I needed. Well, because I was setting up a little garden, it didn't take very long for me to outgrow that, so I had to learn what else I could do. Now, if I were going to just have one pot outside my door, and I wanted to be able to walk out there every afternoon and turn on the spigot for 10 minutes and then turn it back off, I would get something like this. This is a thing that simply screws onto your faucet, and then you can stick in a piece of polytubing, and at the other end of this polytubing you'll need something to control the flow, probably. You can either leave it completely open so that it's like a miniature hose, and then you'll have to control how hard you're blasting that water, because you don't want to blast all the water out of your pot. But it would work. And this thing here that it's attached to is simply called 100 feet of 1/4 inch poly microtubing. That's what they call it. Fancy words. Just means it's an itty-bitty hose and it attaches to this. Now, I think that most people that want to do something like this are doing something a little bit more complicated than that. And so you will need some way to get your water from the faucet to your plants. Now, one thing I'd like to bring up early in this conversation, before I forget about it, is the one kind of thing I do not recommend. It is called, this is by Orbit, and I'm not picking on Orbit. They happen to be Orbit, Rainbird, Dig are, I think, the major suppliers of yeah, that's an Orbit. This is a Dig. Can't see what that one says. It somewhere on there, I'm sure. They're the major suppliers of irrigation parts, and generally speaking, most of your big box stores will have, your home repair places will have 2 or 3 of these at least. I recommend that until you understand how the systems work, probably want to stay with one brand unless somebody who works there says these are compatible. Generally speaking, they are compatible, but you need to pay a little bit of attention. This is called a 1/4 inch by 50 foot porous soaker tubing. If you live someplace, that just means that this is a hose, a tiny hose. It's, a little less than 1/2 inch in diameter on the outside, 1/4 inch on the inside. And when they say a 1/4 inch, they're talking about the inside diameter. Very important concept when you're doing any kind of plumbing. Are we talking ID, which is inside diameter, or OD, which is outside diameter? Those things are important. Most irrigation is 1/4 inch, and therefore the stuff is interchangeable between systems. But this, I guess, works great somewhere. Here it does not work great because we have hard water. Any place that you have hard water, the minerals in your water are going to clog this up. And how fast it clogs it up will be determined by how much rain you get, how many times a day you run this, how many times a week you run this, how completely dry in between it gets. If you tend to get mineral deposits on flower pots, the top of water, anything like that, from your water, this will clog up. If you don't get mineral deposits, we've lived places that had acid water before. These things work pretty well. What they do is you just lay them down along a row of plants or into a pot, and they just seep water. The water literally leaks out through them and soaks into the soil. Now, one thing I should mention is people will sometimes ask me, why bother with drip irrigation? It seems like such a bother. Okay, when I water the top of my soil with a hose, I spray the entire surface, and then some percentage of that will work its way down. It actually takes quite a bit of water if you live someplace that has hydrophobic soil. Hydrophobic soil means it tends to naturally repel water. It's not that nice, loamy stuff. It's not the sandy stuff that the water just goes scooting down through. It's soil that is actually kind of like, you put a little water on it and the water sort of sits there or it'll run away. It doesn't naturally soak in very much. We have hydrophobic soil here. It's very common in the Southwest. Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of California, and I'm sure there's other states, probably parts of Oklahoma, Texas. It depends on where you are as to what your soil is. But if you have soil where the water tends to naturally run off, it takes quite a bit of water applied to the top of that soil before it actually drains down far enough through the soil to get to the roots of your plants. I've told this story a million times. One of my neighbors years ago was complaining that her tomatoes were not doing well, and I said, are you watering enough? She said, oh, I get out there every morning and I water for 5 minutes. And I'm like, I don't think 5 minutes is enough. Oh, I'm sure there's plenty of water on top. And I told her, I said, I still don't think you're watering enough. And a couple of weeks later, I saw her someplace and she said, wow, I was thinking about what you said and I thought about how nice your tomatoes looked and how crummy mine looked, and basically they were dying. And I watered the plants one morning and I thought, I should check. Irene says you should check. And she dug down with her finger and discovered that all that water she had put down had gone down a total of 1/2 inch. Now, I don't know about you, but my tomato plant roots are not 1/2 inch from the top of the surface. They're down 3, 4, 5 inches sometimes. So, of course, her plants were doing crummy. They were never getting that water. It was some small percentage was getting down there, enough to keep them alive, sort of, but not enough to make them do well. So, in an environment like ours, watering the entire top surface does two things. It allows for huge amounts of evaporation, and it encourages weeds. Now, I don't know about you, I don't mind pulling the occasional weed. I was out there pulling them just this morning because we have had some rain in the last month, and therefore every weed seed on the planet seems to be popping up, and grass seeds and all kinds of stuff. And I clear the walkways. Great. The less I have to pull weeds, the happier I am. Sometimes the weeds get so ferocious that it's really hard to pull them without damaging the plants you want to grow. Especially if the plants you want to grow are a little bit spindly and the weed seeds have grown really big and fierce. So what happens when you water with drip irrigation is you have a spot point on the top where the water is coming down, and it forms a cone underground where it literally spreads out like that. And you'll get a spot on the top of the surface that might be, an inch, 2. Sometimes if you've let it run quite a bit, like where our potato beds are right now, the soil surface is really rough and stuff because we just tilled it all up. It hasn't got any kind of a crust on it. So the soil will get wet for about, 5 or 6 inches around each emitter. But outside that area, in between the rows and plants and stuff, there's nothing. And once in our regular beds, the surface has been smoothed completely and mulched and all that kind of stuff, and then we put down our drip irrigation, that water's going pretty much in that cone straight down. Very little water out on the surface means very little weeds. And that's awesome. It really, you get almost no evaporation except from that little teeny spot, and you get almost no weeds. Double bonus from where I'm sitting. So I've got my basic setup. I've got some sort of a connector to the faucet. And then it's going to run out to my plants. Now, if I am going to make a fairly complicated system where I'm going to have a main line that runs out, and then I'm going to have side little lines that go off to various plants and stuff like that, you can set up an entire patio so that you just flip one hose on and it'll water everything at once. Now, how do I make that work? Well, first I need something that connects to the faucet. And if you could see inside this, you'd see it has threads on it just the same as if it were a hose, because it's effectively the part that screws onto the faucet. So, but you'll notice there's nothing there. These sort of things come in multiple sizes. Let's look at the fine print. This is a 3/4 inch swivel adapter, they call it, because this thing will swivel like that. It's kind of like some of the better quality hoses will also swivel like that. In order to use this, I need some sort of hose that goes from here out around my yard to my plants. I'm going to buy something like this. It's not going to be this short, obviously. I just chopped a small piece off because I didn't want to waste a lot. They come in 1/2 inch and they come in 3/4 inch sizes. It does not matter which size you use, but you have to be consistent because the parts are not interchangeable for this part of the hose. So I've got a 3/4 inch thing, I've got a 3/4 inch hole. This actually is a 1/2 inch hose. See, so if I put that in there, it might fit, but it may not stay. As soon as I pressurize this, it'll shoot out. So you have to make sure you've got the right size. Generally speaking, the store will only carry one size. Still a good idea to read the fine print, but okay? So now you've got a hose that runs out around your garden, and it's solid. It's got water coming in this way, and it's got water going out that way. The only trouble is you don't want the water to go out that way. So you need to be able to stop it. So you need an end. And I just happen to have my kit. Pulled it up out of storage this morning because I'm not currently doing this kind of irrigation. And there's 2 different kinds of ends. This is the most common though. And it looks like a figure 8 kind of. You're going to stick the end of this in here. You're going to bend it. And you're going to stick it back through. Again, and this is such a short piece I can't do this well, but it's going to go like that. And this is the same as when you're trying to water your yard and you accidentally fold the hose somewhere, the water stops. So that's how you get your end. You have one of these. Now, okay, I've got my beginning, I've got my end, and I've got my hose, which is obviously, as I said, longer than this. How am I going to get the water out to the individual plants? Well, I'm going to use some sort of miniature hoses. Now, the miniature hoses can be like what they call micro hose. I grabbed this random piece out of the yard today because it was kind of an interesting example. This is more complicated than most people are going to get involved in, but there's 2 different kinds of hoses. You get these 1/4 inch hoses, which are basically, it's a hose, okay? And then you also get micro hoses, which are tiny. They're half the size of this. I thought I brought a piece in, I didn't. Let me go get one. Okay, this is called micro tubing. It is itty bitty. The hole in it is approximately 1/8 of an inch in the center, and the outside is probably about 1/4 of an inch. And a bunch of the patio kits will actually include this because it's perfect for running into a pot. I have a little pot, it's got a flower in it or a tomato in it or something like that. I simply go from whatever my hose is to that pot, stick it in there. I'm going to need a stake, and if you buy a kit, it'll come with the stakes. something like that usually. You're going to clip it on here, stick that in the pot, and you're set. Now, I will warn you, if you have dogs or cats, pay attention to these things, because I have had the cat sneak around the pot before and managed to pull these out of the pots. So, something to be aware of if you have critters around your yard besides you, or you have clumsy children, or you have clumsy spouses, or you are clumsy. But that's one way to get water to the plants. Now, if I am doing a row, say I've got a row of flowers or a row of lettuce or something like that, I am going to want an emitter line. Geez, did I forget that too? I did.